The Spin-off Podcast Network. Contact Energy's good plans give you periods of free or discounted power. The more of your current energy usage you shift to these times, the more you could save. Learn more about these plans at contact.co.nz/goodplans. Conditions, fair use policy and eligibility criteria apply. Power refers to electricity.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise in banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi making Kiwi better off. Let me take you back in time, more than 20 years ago, when there were only 2 telecommunications companies, something called Telecom and something called Vodafone. Now, of course, both of those brand names are gone, and there's a major third player, which is 2degrees. And owning a mobile phone, buying one, having a monthly fee, getting the data, is actually pretty cheap. And now, internationally, New Zealand has one of the best performing, reasonably lowest priced data and mobile and broadband networks in the world, thanks to a bunch of investment in part by the government, but also some really aggressive moves to improve competition about 20 to 25 years ago. This was the breakup of telecom into what is now Chorus and Spark, and the hard regulation of things like number portability and interchange fees between the networks. Back in those days, if you wanted to call someone on another network, you actually paid a lot extra to do it. And so what you'd end up with is that friend groups would find themselves owning 2 mobile phones because they knew that someone else in their friend group was on the other network. And so therefore, if they rang them from the phone in that network, it didn't cost much. This is the sort of nuttiness we saw. And over the years, with the arrival of 2degrees as a third competitor and a continual competition down in effective prices per gigabit and also the prices for connections, we saw a massive improvement, so much of an improvement actually, that in the late 2000s, the Reserve Bank referred to this as the 2degrees effect, a depressing of prices in a particular part of the economy. But unfortunately, it's been the exception that proved the rule, because for the rest of New Zealand, a good 40 to 50% of GDP, by my calculation, is effectively now run by monopolies or duopolies or companies that have massive amounts of market power and which investigations by the Commerce Commission and complaints by many, many people over many, many years have found that we essentially pay higher prices. Those sectors are more profitable, produce more cash for their shareholders than other parts of the world. It's in supermarkets, it's in banking, it's in electricity, it's in airlines, and it's in fuel. We've had market studies on several of those areas, as well as building materials, but nowhere near the same success as we saw in telecommunications. Why is that? Well, now the government is talking a big game about getting competitors in supermarkets, in banking, and also has talked about electricity, although it's pretty conflicted there too because of its 51% ownership of the big 3 players in electricity gentailing. But what would it actually mean to do things in a really aggressive, substantial way, like we saw with the dismembering of telecom and the re-regulation of mobile communications back in the early to mid-2000s? What would you need to do? Well, we spoke to Tex Edwards, one of the founders of 2degrees, who's been watching this like a hawk for a couple of decades and is a spokesman for Monopoly Watch, often is submitting to select committees and market studies on all of these areas. We have a good old chat with him about 3 of those sectors. What would you need to do in supermarkets, in banking, and in electricity to try to really remove this premium we have now embedded in our prices, which are bigger profits than would otherwise be the case if we had competitive markets? And just a quick heads up here, obviously this is a podcast sponsored by KiwiBank, and Tex makes some comments in the podcast about how some believe KiwiBank could be one of the solutions to improving competition. He believes that's not the case. But just to be clear, he's not saying that KiwiBank is saying it's the only solution for increasing competition. It's just that he thinks there needs to be other competitors as well, in particular neobanks. This week on When the Facts Change, we look to see how we can create not just the 2 degrees effect for the economy, but insert brand name here for supermarkets, for banking, and for electricity. This week on When the Facts Change with Tex Edwards. Well, kia ora and welcome to Tex Edwards to When the Facts Change. Tex, it's lovely to have you on.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks for making time for me.
Now, you're in the unusual position of playing a major role in shaking up one of our major sectors, a success story in encouraging competition. Of course, that's mobile telecommunications and the more wide telecommunications area. But you've got some views and you've done a lot of research on supermarkets, banking and electricity. And I thought it'd be useful to ask you, what is it that could be done, starting with supermarkets, right now to actually encourage competition?
I think when we looked at supermarkets with the lens of experienced practitioners in industry transformation, it gets more and more difficult to work out what exactly can you do now quickly that would move the dial in supermarkets that hasn't already been done. It made sense getting a supermarket commissioner. It made sense in new wholesale legislation. It made sense in political and policy focus on this area. But actually, the deeper you dive into the subject matter and the more you look at the market structure and the sheer level of investment that's gone in, not into new technology, not into customer utility, but the sheer amount of investment that's gone into building barriers to entry, all roads, as a sensible strategic analyst or even a central centrist, any business person goes to, the only way you're ever going to achieve competition is to break up the existing cartel. And essentially you have to undo this acquisition where there used to be 3 operators in the New Zealand market and then there became 2. And you have to undo that merger. Sadly, it used to be 25, 50% revenue share. Foodstuffs had 50, 25 to Countdown, 25 to Food Town. And that's why you have a Commerce Commission, because you're not meant to approve these mergers.
So could you actually break up what is now Woolworths, what was Countdown and Food Town? Could you break them up, along those lines, or have they already merged and opened new supermarkets and closed supermarkets, so you couldn't actually pull them apart?
So thanks for that. Yeah, that's a good question. You can't undo the past, and you are where you are today in commercial barriers. These barriers haven't been manicured. They've been polished, manicured, built, rebuilt. And the sheer level of incumbency where you've had these new supermarkets, hypermarkets built, you've had 30 years of building covenants. You actually, to the trained eye, you have monopoly rents are expressed inside the rents the actual supermarkets pay. So you've had a level of overbuild and you've had a level of over-renting, which actually also acts as a barrier. And it's fascinating to study. And I have some sympathy for policymakers and in fact, the minister who's charged with trying to create competition in such a difficult environment. In my mind, it's inevitable that there's a breakup going to take place. You don't need to breach property rights. It's not a breach of a property right. If Jerry Smith owns the Te Amutu Pack and Save, he doesn't have to sell it. He can still own that Pack and Save. He just can't be in a cartel arrangement with the distribution centre called Foodstuffs.
So what would that breakup look like? Would you have to create a separate wholesaling division and a retailing division? Because at the moment, you could argue they already are. Jerry's Pack and Save in Te Awamutu, and just to be clear, there is no Jerry's Pack and Save in Te Awamutu that we know of, but just for example's sake, Jerry's Pack and Save is an individual entity, probably owned by a family. They essentially have a franchise, and they are trading with the cooperative, which is foodstuffs. So how could you break that up? That would be quite hard, wouldn't it?
Essentially, and this is where the not intellectual challenge, but the business case challenge of the breakup comes. You have to introduce a third distribution centre system to New Zealand. And it's at the DC level that you have to make these important changes. And it's really important what the neighbouring supermarkets are doing, the neighbouring supermarkets to Te Awamutu, what the neighbouring supermarket in Hamilton's doing, what the neighbouring supermarket in Kitiroa is doing. And the challenge here in a rural context is quite different from the challenge in the city context, just like it was in telecommunications. And in the telecommunications industry, the Commerce Commission and MB and the minister at the time focused themselves on creating competition in the cities, and that required an understanding of these, what we called geographic monopolies.
Just talking about those geographic monopolies, that's something I don't think people really understand in supermarkets. That over the years, Woolworths and Foodstuffs have effectively carved out little holes in the cities, and they've filled them up with their supermarket. And for most people, they don't want to have to drive more than 10 or 15 minutes to their supermarket. And actually, when you fly over a city, for example, what you actually see is not two supermarket companies hard at in competition. You see two supermarket companies that have colonised and sort of own certain suburbs or catchments. Is that right?
100% correct. That's a great observation. Thanks, Bernard. Because absolutely, we actually invited the Commerce Commission to a helicopter trip. I want to say one of our team was discussed having a helicopter trip with one of the ministers responsible for this area. Because the moment that you're in the chopper and you're flying over the motorway, you see exactly as you described, huge suburbs that are colonised by contiguous one-branded supermarkets. And there was this quite notable observation during the Commerce Commission inquiry when the Woolworths executive was on video, and they were sitting above a supermarket. So they were sitting in their head office, which was based above a supermarket. And you could see a tower crane in the back of the video picture, just like you can see a picture on the wall in the video of me today. And in fact, that tower crane was another supermarket of the same brand being built. And essentially, it was sort of humorous, but it was actually quite sad because it catalogued, and we anchored the point at Monopoly Watch at the time, that in Auckland City, for example, Central City, there's 8 contiguous Woolworths stores. If you're in Ponsonby, there's the Ponsonby Road, Crummer Road, Richmond Road, Woolworths. There's Richmond Road Woolworths. There's Westland Woolworths. There's Point Chev Woolworths. There's Mount Eden Woolworths, and then there was Herne Bay Woolworths. And it's quite a comedy show actually. And we articulated that in our breakup plan, some Woolworths stores would have to be sold to foodstuffs, and some foodstuffs shops would have to be sold to Woolworths. And so you've got this geographic breakup that needs to take place. And how it would look is that in the cities, you would have those suburban HHI ratios calculated. HHI means Herman Hirschfeld Index, which is a monopolisation index, which is market share squared in a 2 kilometre, 4 kilometre, 8 kilometre radius. And when we invited somebody from MB for a helicopter trip, we wanted to chopper them up the northwestern motorway where they just see Pack and Save, Pack and Save, Pack and Save, Pack and Save, and chopper them up the northern motorway up to East Coast Bays. They see Woolworths, Woolworths, Woolworths. And if we chopper them out to Howick, Glendowie area, you'd see New World, New World, New World. And Then they're pepper potted with other what we call metro stores, which is to anchor the colonisation of that suburb. So this is extreme monopolisation. It's not a duopoly. It's geographic monopolies. It's not a breach of property rights, because all we're saying is in those 6 contiguous pack and saves on the northwestern motorway, 2 of them have got to go to a new distribution centre, and that distribution centre needs scale.
And so that sounds good. You've got maybe an exchange of supermarkets between the 2 groups, although it is interesting that one of the groups, Foodstuffs, has individual store owners, and that might be therefore a bit more difficult. But then there's the other option of stripping bits and pieces out and creating a third player, which someone from overseas could buy, or local capital can invest in a separate player. Is that possible?
I think it's possible, and more likely that you'll get a local player. You'll get a consortium. In a consortium, you need third-party expertise. It's got global expertise in operating supermarkets and heavyweight relationships with large suppliers. It's noteworthy that the fundamental difference in the supermarket discussion between large suppliers and small suppliers. So small suppliers who have no market power get pummeled to death by the supermarkets. And the big institutional global multinationals, they've got market power. And in fact, they're complicit in this arrangement, and they prefer just to have 2 operators. And it became absolutely clear in the Commerce Commission study that the big suppliers loved it to pieces, that there were just 2 players. And if you look at some organisations, particularly like Coca-Cola, Kraft, Asahi, Unilever, they're their most profitable global operations on a per capita basis in New Zealand, because they don't have the pressure that they have in other competitive markets. Answering your question, if you had to geographically break up some of the foodstuffs operations, it's almost childish and it's almost bleating by rich foodstuffs supermarket operators that their hard work is turning to custard, and that they should be allowed to continue as they are, because essentially they can continue to own their supermarket. They can continue to own their supermarket. They just have to be shareholders in the third operator. And the same relationship that they have today with foodstuffs, not cooperative, but aggressive strategic interchange monopoly, where they've signed restrictive covenants. They've been on notice several times with multiple Commerce Commission afflictions pertaining to commercial activities. They can just pick up their supermarket and start working and being a shareholder in the third operator, or that matter, the fourth operator. And look, if these people are so fabulous at running their business and they support their communities, everybody will follow them to where they're going. And that's why we actually, particularly with the new age barriers to entry, we catalogued the breakup, not just of supermarkets, but also the data, because the client records, just like your bank account is proprietary to mum and dad or auntie cousin, your swipe card that has all your loyalty information, that has all your consumer behaviour cast in stone, that has proprietary value, and that must be broken up as well, and that must be owned by the individual. So the individual consumer, when a third operator comes and a fourth operator comes, can take that data to the third and fourth operator.
There is a lot of volatility and uncertainty out there, particularly offshore. But you know what? There's some good news. The New Zealand economy is recovering from a deep and painful recession. This year is predicted to be better than last, and 2026 looks even brighter. Lower interest rates are fueling a recovery, easing the cost of living and creating opportunities for businesses. Learn more about New Zealand's positive economic outlook at kiwibank.co.nz.
McDonald's meets the Minecraft universe with one of 6 collectibles and your choice of a Big Mac or 10-piece McNuggets with spicy nether flame sauce. Now available with a Minecraft movie meal.
At participating McDonald's for a limited time, a Minecraft movie only in theaters.
You know that feeling when someone shows up for you just when you need it most? That's what Uber is all about. Not just a ride or dinner at your door. It's how Uber helps you show up for the moments that matter. Because showing up can turn a tough day around or make a good one even better. Whatever it is, big or small, Uber is on the way. so you can be on yours. Uber, on our way.
So that's interesting, breaking up the data as well. And that probably brings us into our next area, which is banking. The government's made some pretty loud noises about doing things to improve competition in banking. But what could be done there to really, get some competitive fire on those big four?
Thanks for asking that, Bernard, because it's actually quite strategic talking about banking right after supermarkets. Supermarkets is complex, and you've had 20 years of entrenchment, and you have a lot of bricks and mortar and logistical activities with fresh and frozen big distribution centres that have to be geographically located, and you have to have a geographic relationship with somebody who's growing the sweet corn and the broccoli and getting it to the freezer, to the fridge, and then distributing it. So it's quite complex. And that is a complex portfolio of geographic monopolies to break up. Banking, however, I don't know. Have you heard of the internet, Bernard? Have you heard of it? A lot of people haven't. Well, obviously, the New Zealand government hasn't heard of the internet because every other country in the world, Bernard, except New Zealand, every other OECD country has what they call neobanks, or a layman like myself would call challenger banks. And challenger banks are internet-only, branchless service providers of financial services that can make payments. New Zealand isn't 5 years behind. New Zealand isn't 10 years behind. New Zealand is 15 years behind the rest of the world in permitting open banking and facilitating the capitalisation of neobanks. The misinformation and the absolute BS that's been going on in Wellington and the lobbying crapshoot nonsense that's taken place in banking is outrageous. And yesterday, the government could have fertilised the capitalisation of neobanks and kicked off internet-only challenger banks. It's a little game, and it's a lobbying trick by the incumbents that Kiwi Bank's going to fix anything. Kiwi Banks is a bricks and mortar, 1980s, 1990s style branch banking network. The way to fix competition amongst the big four who've acted in cartel style behaviours is through capitalising challenger banks. And it's a complete standout from the rest of the world. And that can be fixed much easier than supermarkets.
So why haven't these neobanks come to New Zealand and said, "Wow, this is a free kick. There's no other competitors here. We've got some capital because we've been successful overseas. Let me jump into New Zealand." What's stopping them?
Point one, New Zealand is 15 years late in starting open banking. Point one. Point two is Payments New Zealand is owned by the big four banks. So the big four banks are playing smother and smooth over new banks. They're doing resellers agreements. They're doing open banking, but they're simultaneously capturing all the data and managing it their way. They're preventing the regulatory capitalisation of challenger banks. And it's outrageous, actually, because Denmark is the best example. 42% of all banking revenue by market share sits in neobanks or challenger banks in Denmark. In the UK, for example, challenger banks almost got 15% market share, up from like 3% in 2020. It's quite impressive.
So what interventions did the regulators in Europe and the UK make to make it much easier for these neobanks to come in there and compete?
Point one, they opened the payments market and they had open banking 10 years ago, point one. Point two, then they arranged a suite of initiatives which helped these challenger banks get capital and get regulatory compliance. And so it was the initiative that the central banks, in line with their competition authorities, particularly the CMA in the UK, they facilitated that the incumbent monopoly banks that the government had been supporting through the global financial crisis, and in New Zealand's case also through COVID, they forced those banks to gift money and grant money to the challenger banks. That was extreme. And as a consequence, the challenger banks got almost free capital and they were able to kick off sensible initiatives. Here in New Zealand, you've got what we call white labelling or resellers agreement. And if we put that back into telecommunications language, in telecommunications language, if you're a telecommunications monopoly, you always want to have a reseller or different brands and have what we call flanker brands. And in New Zealand, what we're going to see is a plethora of flanker brands, and all the almost childish board members and senior exec of the big four banks will go, oh, this new brand's coming, open banking's coming, praise the Lord. But what we're not going to see is a like-for-like internet competitor that offers a full suite of financial services that owns the entire value chain. And this is a very important concept because it just shows how aggressive lobbying is in New Zealand and how aggressively the lobbyists have gotten control of this. Monopoly Watch was very disappointed to see that the banks were leading part of the Indian trade mission. We think that was misguided because you could have easily capitalised a neobank on that trade mission, point one. And point two, in the infrastructure conference, there was no discussion about challenger neobanks and why a neobank would start here. And the moment that you start a neobank, you've also got what we call abuse of significant market power. And that's where I think the Minister's initiative and her announcement about her request for information about breaking up supermarket cartel was fantastic, because she discussed significant market power, I think, 4 times in the first 2 pages. And she discussed scale, I think, 8 times in the first 2 pages. And she actually also discussed J-curves. So she talked about the losses that these challengers would have to make. And I think that quite quickly you'll see government understand that challenger banks are the way forward, that Kiwi Bank has so much incumbency cost structure that Kiwi Bank is a higher cost operator per capita per pop than the big four Aussie, and so they'll be looking for these low cost operators, and implementing neobanks would be a great easy win for the government. And remember that the government provide and cuddle up to these big four Aussie banks. It's not as if they haven't benefited from what we call the too big to fail guarantee. They benefited from that in the global financial crisis, but also most recently in COVID, they've benefited from it. And I have to say that when somebody asks me, why do you think there's such a high degree of monopolisation in some of these utility businesses in New Zealand, Tex, I say, well, we have to look at the lack of lobbyist legislation. Because when we look at what the banking lobbyist fraternity have done, it's just outrageous. There's nowhere else in the world you could leave cabinet and then join the main board of the largest bank, less than 6 months later. There's no way you could end your journalist job, a government-owned journalist job, and then jump in the lobbyist bandwagon of a bank. It's outrageous.
Yeah, so that's those first 2 sectors of supermarkets and banking. The third one has an interesting quirk to it, electricity, in that the 3 biggest players are 51% owned by the government itself, which, although it doesn't say it is the pure regulator, it certainly controls the regulators, the Electricity Authority, the Commerce Commission. So electricity, what could we do there?
Well, for starters, absolutely break off the retailers from the generators, so that break the gentailers up, point one. Point two is it's really noteworthy looking at executive outcomes and senior leadership outcomes in the electricity players, because they've had public listed stock prices, they pay lovely dividends. The executive compensation is tied to those outcomes. And so, of course, they've got ESG for Africa. They're discussing environmental, social governance issues. But at the end of the day, it's the level of profitability and the increase in dividends, increasing the dividends of government. But the senior executives have been beneficiaries of big ESOP deals in those companies.
So when you say ESOP, you're talking here about executive share options schemes. Yep.
Yeah. And if you look at the executive comp in the electricity sector, I think Vector's probably the best example. But if you look at the benchmarks, the local guy gets $3.5 million, $4 million bucks a year. If you benchmarked and had that job benchmarked in Europe for a similar size utility, you'd be earning 500 grand a year. But not only that, you've got the sheer level of market power, where if you look at the electricity retailing business, the dominant players have just bought off and toyed with what we call flanker brands. And that's where actually there's a lot of similar competition law issues that come to play here. And that's why, in banking, for example, we unreservedly said to the Commerce Commission, flanker brands should be banned by the incumbent for 5 years. Well, flanker brands should be banned in the electricity sector to help get cut through for those new players, point one. Point two is, I think in electricity it's quite exciting because you've got a lot of new technology coming on board. You've got new metering technology, you've got solar getting much, much cheaper, and then you've got EVs passing the tipping point to where you're going to see consumers in our lifetime go to 50% plus in EVs. And as a consequence of this new technology, you've got a breaking down of what we call network effects, where somebody owned the distribution network or somebody owned all the generation. They had complete dominance. And that's where these interconnection arrangements are very important. Not dissimilar, again, from telecommunications, where you've got a network, and in economics, it's called the network effect, where somebody who's got dominance, everybody's tipped into their customer ecosystem. It is where you need interconnection and you need appropriate pricing for each component of the value chain in electricity. So you need a vigilant regulator there.
Just finally, Tex, you and I have both got plenty of grey hair. And it was 20 years ago now when the government of the day, the then Labor government, got serious about reforming the telecommunications sector to get more competition in there. And it did have to break up the incumbent into a wholesale division and a retail division, which then Telecom became Spark and Chorus. And there was some very significant intervention by the Commerce Commission in terms of pricing of the fees to move from one network to the next, and the sorts of things like movable numbers, phone numbers. It was an awful lot of regulatory and big work, shifting assets around and passing laws. It was a really big deal. It dominated the news agenda for years on end. That was 20 years ago. Just to give people a sense of the size of the prize, we've you could argue have faffed around, haven't really achieved much in competition in those other three big areas of our economy. What if we got it right? We got it right in telecommunications to a broad extent. And that led to what the Reserve Bank called the 2 degrees effect, which actually dragged down pricing in a significant part of the economy. What is the size of the prize if we were to get it right over the next 20 years in those three areas?
I think it's something like 3 to 5% of GDP, including the multiplier effect. And my favourite number in my banking submission, which was taken as granted, was that the average Kiwi consumer, if you're a 25-year-old couple, first home owner, and you buy the average size New Zealand mortgage, if you had challenger banks, and you had what Denmark had or Sweden had or Norway had, you would pay $1.2 million less to your bank over your lifetime. And your KiwiSaver as a 25-year-old, you would be looking forward to, in today's 2025 money, being $1.25 million better off when you retire. That is the size just on banking, right? Then you've got the supermarket monopoly rents you're paying. Then you've got the electricity monopoly rents you're paying. Then there's other monopoly rents in building materials and airlines. And if we're closing off, one of my favourite statistics in the building industry was that Triangle Aura had been caught building houses at $11,000 a square metre. International best practice of high quality social housing is $900 a square metre. That's a tenth. So in New Zealand, we're building at the margin, of course, but we're building 5 to 10 times more expensively than our international best practice people. So it gives lots of room to manoeuvre. And these are intergenerational issues. And I, again, close off the meeting, my favourite public policy wonk, my favourite politician's comment was Sir Bill English when he'd exited his government role as a politician. He said, unless you can solve the tangled web of affordability for the next generation, you are definitely going to see aggressive capital taxes in New Zealand occur. And he really focuses the pressure on politicians to make progress in these affordability issues because you've got economic sustainability at stake here.
We shall watch the space. Tex Edwards from Monopoly Watch, one of the founders of 2 Degrees, and Tex, fantastic to have you on, and no doubt we'll be back again as we see some progress or no progress and some new ideas in the months and years ahead.
Never a dull day watching Monopolies, that's for sure.
That's right. Thank you very much for being on When the Facts Change. When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.